You're in Toronto right now, and Justin Trudeau, he interrupts a woman at a town hall. She's asking him a question, and he didn't like one of the words that she used. Listen to this soundbite, and then we'll get your reaction.
All right.
So that's why we came here today to ask you to also look into the policies that religious charitable organizations have in our legislation so that it can also be changed, because maternal love is the love that's going to change the future of mankind. So we'd like you to look
we like to say people kind, not necessarily mankind, because it's more inclusive.
There we go, exactly.
And the crowd roars.
Yeah, well, it's quite the performance. I mean, I'm afraid that our Prime Minister is only capable of running his ideas on a few very narrow ideological tracks. We saw the first evidence of that when he put his cabinet together. He insisted upon making it 50% women, despite the fact that only about 22% of the elected MPs were women. And it was easier for him to do that than it was for him to screen people for the sort of competence that would actually be necessary to be cabinet members. So we've seen a fair bit of this behavior, but that was the most egregious example, I suppose. When I look at Trudeau, there's a couple of things that I see. I see someone who hasn't grown up. I mean, one of the most appalling things about the budget, as far as I was concerned, is that it provides ample evidence, if such was not sufficiently provided already, that Trudeau is exactly what you would be afraid of if you were afraid of him. He doesn't have an answer to a problem that isn't overwhelmingly predictable ideologically. It's like you don't even need him. You just have to run the ideology. It has the answers. What's the big problem? Equity between men and women. It's like, sorry, that's not the big problem. That's not even, you're not even scratching the surface of the problem with that approach. And your solutions, it's like you can learn those solutions your first week in women's studies. They're not solutions. They're the sorts of solutions that children toy with when they have no idea what they're contending with. Yeah, well, there's not a lot there, I'm afraid. Fixing these complex systems is unbelievably complicated, and you're likely to make them worse when you're mucking about with them haphazardly, right? And so it's way easier just to do this. Trudeau said it back in, wasn't it 2016? Why are half the cabinet women? Because it's 2000 and, was it 16 or 15? Yeah. Well, it's almost impossible to overstate how shallow that comment is, and how not only shallow, but it's also casually malevolent in an unconscious sense, because he had a job to do, which was to evaluate his MPs thoroughly and skeptically and pick the best people, period. But that isn't what he did. He said, oh, well, it's 2016, so I'll appoint half women. It's like, well, everybody gave him a pass on that, and so here we are. Now we have a budget that's equity-focused. Yeah, well, good luck with that. When I look at Trudeau, there's a couple of things that I see. I see someone who hasn't grown up. So he's Peter Pan. I see someone he knows how to behave in public. That's one thing you can say about him. He's got that easy charisma and charm that comes from being good-looking, being from a favored background, the favored background that he's from. He's got by on that. And the reason I believe that is because I don't believe that if he had any true character that he would have run, because he ran on the strength of his name, and he hadn't earned the right to do that. But people elected him, so here we are. And this is what we get. I mean, he pulled out the ideological card when he formulated the cabinet, and Canadians all went, oh, isn't that cute? It's like, no, it's not cute. It's not acceptable. And I could win, and then I could fail, and that seemed like a really stupid strategy. I talked to some of the people that I'm communicating with on a regular basis. I've talked to them about this quite regularly. I thought about running in the last Liberal leadership race. Then I thought about running in the last Conservative leadership race. And then I thought about running when all this fell apart, provincially, because I think Kathleen Wynne is an utter disaster. I think she's the most dangerous woman in Canada. And the Conservatives are in terrible disarray. But, I thought it through. I thought, look, well, let's just take the situation with the power grid in Ontario. It's a mess. All right. So if I felt that I would be able to do something credible about that, let's say, that would probably be 6 months worth of 16-hour-a-day study, nonstop, just to understand it. It's like, I'm not prepared. You know, it's a hard job. If you take it as a job, if you're serious about this, you have to understand it. And like the hydrogrid is just one small corner of the complexity of Ontario, let's say. I thought, well, I could throw my hat in the ring and it would make for an interesting political, it would make for interesting politics. But then I could win and then I could fail. And that seemed like a really stupid strategy. And then I'd also have to stop doing everything else I'm doing. And that doesn't seem advisable at the moment. You know, because I think I've thought about politics my whole life, ever since I was 14, even younger than that. And I've always made the same decision, which was to work at the psychological level, essentially, rather than at the political level. I think it's for me, it's the right level.
I'm curious as to what your thoughts are on Justin Trudeau, your current Prime Minister, and your government in general.
I think he's appalling. Well, I think our Prime Minister is exactly what you would have been afraid of had you been properly afraid when he first put himself out on the scene. So this is, when Justin Trudeau ran for office, I thought, I don't have any respect for what you're doing, because you wouldn't be doing this if your father wasn't the most famous Prime Minister in Canada in the last 50 years. So you have a family name, Trudeau, and you're capitalizing on that. And that's, I would say, well, that shouldn't disqualify you from political office, but you should have earned your name before you dared to throw your hat in the ring. And there's no evidence whatsoever that he had earned his name. And there's certainly no evidence now. So I thought, well, I'm very suspicious of your character, because you should have thought very long and hard about daring to run for political office on the strength of your name alone. It's a narcissistic and juvenile thing to do, but he did it. And then I thought, okay, well, it was time for a new government in Canada. It was time for a change. And despite the fact that it was an error in judgment to run in that manner, maybe you'll be credible. But then the first thing he did, and there was no excuse for this, and it set the tone for everything else that has happened, is he formulated his cabinet and he made it 50% women, despite the fact that only 26% of the elected representatives were women. And when pressed on that, he said, well, because it's 2015, which is a facile answer. His responsibility was to go through his members of parliament and to pick the most qualified people to do the hard work necessary to do a characterological and skills analysis of every single one of those people, and pick the best people, regardless of their race, creed, color, or sex, period. And he didn't do that, and Canadians gave him a free pass. And that was a very bad idea, because, well, first of all, because it was an abdication of responsibility. Second, because it was kowtowing to an ideological position. And third, because he stacked his cabinet with people who were ideologues who weren't qualified. And now we're seeing the consequences of that. The last budget, for example, the whole budget, the main theme of the budget is to address the inequitable situation between men and women, which doesn't even exist. So he's twisted the whole budget to solve a fictional problem with an ideological strategy.
It sounds very similar to what's going on here, where it's all about kind of targeted demographics and putting people in a position because they're women or because they're black, not because they're competent in that necessary position. And this has real-world consequences for many people in South Africa. The last 9 years have been anything but sterling for the average South African, and particularly bad for the poor. Are you very optimistic about South Africa and what kind of a future we have?
I'm very pessimistic about your country. I think you guys are in for an absolute catastrophe over the next 10 years. I hate to say that, but this last bit of legislation with regards to the farmers' lands, that's really, really, really not good.
What do you think of the stories you've read about South Africa in the news in the last little while? It seems that we've cracked the nod in some quite important foreign papers when it comes to this discussion about expropriation of property without compensation.
Well, I was absolutely heartbroken, I would say, when I read the news from South Africa this week. I think it's politically expedient to do what your government is doing. I think it appeals to the worst in everyone. I understand that South Africa has extremely serious social problems and that inequality in South Africa is very, very high. And it's not obvious at all what to do about that, and it's clear that it's suboptimal. But to demolish the rule of law as a precursor to solving that problem only means that it's going to get way, way, way worse before it gets better. I mean, isn't it reasonable to think of Zimbabwe as an example? Is that an unreasonable comparison?
Well, Venezuela. I mean, the same people who would implement stupid, proven policies of destruction in South Africa would probably want to use Venezuela as an example, even though it's a lamentable, demonstrable